we had a split in the U.S. anti-war movement. I mean, the groups that I still work with, I won't mention some of their names, but everybody knows them. Some of them said to the Answer Coalition and to me personally, we can't work with you anymore because we're standing with the Syrian revolution against Assad, or we're standing with the Libyan revolution against Gaddafi. And I was like, these are not revolutions. These are counter-revolutions. Like every counter-revolutions don't announce themselves as counter-revolutions. They announce themselves as revolutions because it's something hopeful, something new, something better. They don't say we're going backwards. They're saying we're going forward. So there's no counter-revolution that announces itself as a counter-revolution. It's just a new revolution. But if you have a new revolution supported by the CIA, supported by the Erdogan regime in Turkey, supported by the Saudis, I mean, all of these ultra-reactionary forces are somehow supporting revolutionaries. And at the same time, you have big parts of the U.S. left on the same side.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. On a recent episode of this show, I spoke with Becker, host of the Socialist Program, to discuss the long history of the state attacking and weakening the U.S. left. We talked about World War I and the Palmer raids, the Cold War and McCarthyism, the Civil Rights Movement and COINTELPRO, the anti-war movement during Vietnam, and then the first Gulf War, and how all of that is still relevant. On today's show, Brian joins me once again to discuss the more recent state of the U.S. left following the War on Terror up until today. How did 9/11 change the direction of the U.S. left? What about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan? The election of Obama and then Trump? The Arab Spring, Russiagate, and now the war in Ukraine and the new Cold War with Russia and China? And what's the path forward? But before we jump into it, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can help it grow by becoming a patron at patreon.com/breakthrough news or by donating below on YouTube. Brian, welcome back to the show.
Great to be here. Thank you.
It's good to have you back on to continue our conversation from the last episode. And of course, I'll link to our last episode in the description. And we talked about like a good 80 years, maybe more of history last time. But I was thinking this time we could delve more into more recent history, kind of starting in the end of the 90s, early 2000s, in terms of the impact of U.S. politics and world events on the left, how the left was treated, how it changed the left. And I think a good place to begin would be, I wasn't a part of, I think I was still in middle school when the anti-globalization protests were going on. But I often hear from people who were involved in those protests that the left was on the rise in the late 90s. The anti-globalization protests on the West Coast were such a big deal. And then 9/11 happened. And that really dampened those protests and that movement. And everything on the left really shifted. People were even scared to be anti-war. So let's start there. Let's start with 9/11, the War on Terror. You've been a part of the left for your whole life, basically, and you've been an organizer for a very long time. How did that impact your ability to organize after 2001?
Well, and Rania, I think it would actually be better to roll the clock back just a little bit to get us to get us back to September 11th, because as you mentioned, in Seattle in 1999, there was a very large-scale protest against IMF meetings and World Bank meetings taking place in Seattle. And that was the anti-globalization movement. It was a movement that was really dominated by it was really the rise of anarchism in the U.S. left, and also the first time that nonprofit organizations or non-governmental organizations were also in the streets and in alliance with parts of the labor movement against the impact of globalization. Parts of the protest were about the impact of globalization on U.S. workers, meaning the race to the bottom, the deindustrialization of the United States, driving wages down, offshoring production to Mexico or to Taiwan or to China or elsewhere. So part of it was about the impact on U.S. workers. And a big part of the protests were also how the rapacious nature of US-based transnational corporations were super exploiting the third world, the so-called third world in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. And that protest was sort of the beginning of a new movement, or what appeared to be a new movement. It wasn't really that new globally. The anti-globalization protests have been quite significant globally, and especially in the global South. But it came to the United States in these big protests in Seattle in 1999. I was at that time the co-director of an organization called the International Action Center in New York City. It was founded by Ramsey Clark. We had been the leadership of one of the wings of the anti-war movement in the first Iraq war. And then we were also organizing big protests against the Yugoslav war. People might not know that at this time, but we had demonstrations of 10, 15,000 people in New York City against the bombing of Yugoslavia that began in March 1999 and went all the way until June 1999. So the International Action Center, which was decidedly not an anarchist organization, coming more from the Marxist left, we became part of that movement. We were there in Seattle. But in the next round of protests, which were in April 2000 in Washington, D.C., we organized a protest at the beginning, the first day before the other big protest, timed to coincide with the IMF World Bank meetings, that was protesting what we called the prison industrial complex. And we called for the freedom also of U.S. political prisoners. And we showed the connection between globalization and mass incarceration. As jobs were leaving the United States, millions of people were being defuturized, especially in cities. And young people, instead of being offered a decent education or decent paying jobs, were being basically shoveled into the prisons. And that's how the prison population in the US doubled within a 15-year period, went from 1 million to 2.3 million in about 15 years. And like an amazing level of mass incarceration of an entire generation. And on that first day of those protests, we were mass arrested. We were marching on the sidewalk. It was peaceful. The police we were in connection with, in communication with the police. I was talking to the police. They said at the end, "Where do you want to march?" And I said, "We're going to end at DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C." And they said, "Well, go up 20th Street. At that time, we were in front of the IMF. And then they surrounded us. They blockaded us. They wouldn't let us go forward or backwards. They mass arrested us. And 700 of us were arrested. And through the whole night, people were hogtied. I was tied wrist to ankle when I refused to forfeit and plead out as the police were demanding. These were preemptive arrests by the Metropolitan Police Department trying to shut down the globalization movement. And instead of shutting it down, the demonstrations grew and grew and grew. I mean, it became a mass movement throughout 2000. And then the big development in the fall of 2000 was the election. And George W. Bush, who lost the election by 500,000 votes, became the president of the United States after weeks of indecision when the U.S. Supreme Court, by a 5-4 majority, the conservatives ruled that Bush would suffer irreparable harm by continuing to count votes in Florida. So even though Bush lost the election in popular vote, and if the Florida votes had been counted, he would have lost the Electoral College too, but they stopped the vote count. Bush became president. And on January 20th, 2001, this is 9 months before September 11th, we organized a demonstration. We now still part of this anti-globalization trend, organized a demonstration at Bush's inauguration where we had 100,000 people, far more than Bush supporters came to his inauguration on January 20th, 2001. So Bush was extremely unpopular. There was a mass movement growing. And then 9 months later, on September 11th, the terrorist attacks happened. And Rania, at that time, that anti-globalization movement broke apart. And there was a huge debate. And one wing of the movement, which we led actually at that time, and this was the formation of the Answer Coalition 3 days after September 11th, we said, let's go forward with the planned protests that were designed to be against the next meetings of the IMF on September 29th, 2001. And the other wing of the movement, which was predominantly anarchist led at that time, said, no, this is inappropriate to protest. We shouldn't protest right now. The country is filled with grief and anger and, all of the thousands of people who died in these horrific attacks on September 11th. This is not the right time. And we said, no, we have to go forward. That's when Answer, Act Now to Stop War and End Racism, was formed, because we said what's going to happen is that George W. Bush, Cheney, the neocons, who were at that time just a faction, not the entire ruling class, foreign policy establishment, would take advantage of the September 11th attacks to carry out another foreign policy shift, meaning a hyper-aggressive, militarized, military interventionist approach in the Middle East to reshape the resource-rich area of the Middle East. And that was a dividing point. That was the end of the globalization movement as we knew it. That iteration ended in the birth of a new movement, the anti-war movement. And on September 29th, 2001, we had 25,000 people come out. That was 18 days after September 11th. So this notion that the anti-war movement was completely extinguished isn't actually accurate. In fact, it was the rebirth of a new movement under very, very difficult circumstances, because Bush, who was so unpopular, now had an approval rating of 90%. He had a 90% approval rating a couple of weeks after September 11th. So this very unpopular president, who was considered to be illegitimate because he was in office as a consequence of a stolen election, suddenly became the war president and a popular president. And that changed the direction of the left in the US.
Right. And then, of course, we talked in the last episode a bit about the Afghanistan war and how there was it was like difficult to get people against it because of the way that September 11th was weaponized to justify that war. But then Iraq was a different story. There was a lot of antagonism and opposition across the sort of like left to liberal spectrum against the war in Iraq, which I think we also talked about a bit in the last episode. But I wanted to ask you about something that happened after that. Obviously Bush still went to war in Iraq, still destroyed the country on this sort of like axis of evil tour that where they wanted to go after one country after another across the region to take out any sort of independent post-colonial governments, to take resources or whatever. But that was like, because a lot of that happened as well because there was a Republican president, because there was all this opposition to Bush. Then comes Obama. This is something we didn't talk about, because I think this is an important part of the story of the last 20 years, is what the election of Barack Obama, somebody who campaigned on the notion of being anti-war, even though he wasn't actually in the Senate to vote against the war when it came down to it, but claimed to be anti-war, had expressed some opposition to it when it was popular for Democrats to do so, especially at the height of the civil war in Iraq. So he's kind of campaigning on this anti-war sentiment against Bush's wars. And then he's also the first Black president of the United States. What does this do to the left? What does this do to the anti-war movement? In what ways did that pacify some of that anti-war sentiment? Because obviously Obama came to power and the wars didn't stop.
Right, but I do think it's important. There's kind of an overgeneralization on this issue, which I'd like to address.
Of course.
Because in 2007, the year before Obama is elected, again, he doesn't actually take office until January 2009, but the election was November 2008. In January 2007, there was a demonstration of several 100,000 against the occupation of Iraq. Then on September 15th, Answer Coalition had a march on the Capitol against what was then called the surge, which was the escalation of sending more troops under Bush to Iraq in order to stop what was obviously going to be the victory of the resistance forces in Iraq. And we had a demonstration of 100,000. So, okay, the anti-war movement's still going pretty strong in September 2007. In 2008, there's this massive economic crisis in the United States, and the war in Iraq starts to also become sort of secondary because the U.S. is actually beginning the withdrawal from Iraq. The surge is over. It's sort of stalemated in Iraq, but a new phenomena, the complete meltdown of the capitalist economy in the United States, which ripples, well, not like a ripple, like a tsunami all over the world, really tanks the world capitalist economy. And it's in that context that Obama is running for president. Now, just think about it. Here's a man, Barack Hussein Obama, a black man in a racist country running for president in the midst of a lost war and in the midst of a capitalist economic crisis unparalleled since the Great Depression of the 1930s. And his whole theme was, we're going to make change. Very ill-defined. We're going to end the Iraq war, he said, which is a dumb war, unlike the Afghanistan war, which was presumably a smart war. And we're gonna deal with the capitalist economy. And so you had this profound shift in American politics where even in racist strongholds in all white areas, people were voting, working class folks were voting for Obama. A lot of people who voted for Trump in 2016 and 2020 voted not once, but twice for Obama. Mm-hmm. So there was a sense that the country needed to have some profound change. People wanted change. Obama was different. He was the first black president. He was young. He wasn't George W. Bush. He immediately got the Nobel Peace Prize. That you could call that the Nobel Peace Prize for having accomplished what? I mean, he had just come into office. He gets the Nobel Peace Prize. I guess it was the prize for not being George W. Bush. I mean,
right.
Was what the prize was. You are not George W. Bush, so we're going to incentivize you to take a new policy for the U.S. instead of endless war. But the other thing that happened, so there's a lot of hopefulness in the country, like maybe change could come. And I was at Obama's inauguration on January 2009. As a matter of fact, the Answer Coalition, we got bleachers. We had thousands of working class folks on the inaugural parade route insisting that the war in Iraq really be ended, the Afghanistan war be ended, and that all the people who were losing their homes, 9 million families were going into foreclosure. We demanded that they should be bailed out instead of the bank. So we had this kind of progressive voice at the Obama inauguration, but there were 3 million people there, 3 million. And when George W. Bush got in the helicopter and was, leaving, sort of symbolically leaving Washington, and Obama was taking the oath of office, everybody along Pennsylvania Avenue gave the helicopter the bird. Everybody was like, F you, George W. Bush. It was kind of like this sense, the millions of people thinking like, not only is Bush leaving, but the Bush era is ending. Right. And Obama's going to do something different. And so there was this kind of utopian sort of honeymoon feeling. And at the same time, Obama then did say, we are leaving Iraq. U.S. is going to leave Iraq. But he simultaneously surged tens of thousands more troops to Afghanistan.
Right.
So it had this sort of confusion in the public, like he's somebody different. There's a lot of hopefulness. He's ending the war in Iraq. He said, we're going to leave completely by 2011. And at the same time, surging towards Afghanistan. So it had one part of the peace movement was already really pro-Democratic Party. Our wing, the Answer Coalition wing, which was anti-imperialist and decidedly not pro-democratic, we kept organizing anti-war protests. So on March 19th, 2009, 2 months after Obama came in, we had a demonstration, which was a march on the Pentagon. And we had 10,000 people came. But that was kind of it for the anti-war movement. We tried it the next year and we had like 5,000 people. So we were going from demonstrations of tens of thousands to 10,000 to 5,000. They were getting smaller as a consequence of these political factors. Yes, there was a wing of the of the anti-war movement that was just going to embrace the Democrats no matter what. But I think the movement would have diminished anyway because of these sort of assortment of political realities that were confronting the left. So there was a period where, that there was kind of a honeymoon. But again, Occupy, which starts in 2011. 2011 is an amazing year when you think about it. That's a year, not that long after Obama takes office, a year and a half later, or a year and 10 months later, you have the Arab Spring. And I know we want to talk about that. You had the takeover of the Capitol building in Madison, in Wisconsin, tens of thousands of young people, basically a complete shutdown of the Wisconsin government over right-wing budget cuts. And then you had the Occupy movement in September 2011. So even though there was this honeymoon period for Obama, things start to revive again. The left starts to revive in these different iterations.
Right. I remember the Occupy movement. I mean, that's when I started to get into activism and into journalism. And that was quite an exciting time. And it did happen under Obama. And then, of course, you had Black Lives Matter, those protests in Ferguson, Wisconsin, in Ferguson, in Missouri, in Baltimore over Freddie Gray. Like, all of these things happened under Obama. They were huge uprisings. So obviously, it's not like the left just like went away. But then, of course, in terms of the anti-war left, and we talked a little bit about this last time, but I wanted to emphasize a few other points of it. And that is the way the Arab Spring really fractured the left, right? You had this uprising in Egypt that everybody was, of course, on board with, because Egypt is this like horrible, tyrannical country that, of course, is like in bed with U.S. imperialism. And Tunisia. But then, of course, once it starts to spread to Libya and Syria, this is when U.S., the imperialists, start to take advantage and try to use this protest momentum to push for regime change. And I think this was a shift from like sort of war on terror to like the sort of regime change wars that we were used to from before, but maybe my generation wasn't used to, because I came up when it was all just war on terror, Islamic extremism, Muslims are a problem, Islam is the problem, Arabs are the problem. And so it was really like disorienting when it came to Libya and Syria to suddenly hear the opposite of that, which is like, no, it's Islamophobic not to support like these jihadist groups in Syria that the U.S. is arming to overthrow Assad, or to not support these jihadist groups in Libya and their agency against Gaddafi. And this is what, I mean, at least, you know, being a part of the Arab community, this was my first experience with having like done a lot of journalism around the issue of drone strikes and anti-Muslim sentiment and Islamophobia and U.S. foreign policy, and the way the U.S. invokes the existence of jihadist groups to justify bombing and intervening in countries, to then have this like bizarre split where I was saying, wait, no, we shouldn't be supporting these people in Syria and Libya, but then having people within the Arab and Muslim community actually then calling me an Islamophobe, because I was like, no, these people in Syria are like really, really, really bad. And then this of course, had a spillover effect on the Palestine Solidarity movement, which I actually don't think was an accident. I mean, we know the Israel lobby even has like, you know, written policy about using other wars like as like whataboutism, right? And like, you know, to like try to fracture Palestine solidarity, which worked quite well across college campuses, where Palestine solidarity was quite popular and successful, especially in passing BDS resolutions, to then like a lot of Palestine solidarity groups actually collapsing and fracturing over the issue of Syria, for example. So I'm curious, like from your end as an anti-war activist and organizer, how did this play out in the sort of circles you were in?
Yeah, it was really, as you said, decisive. I think what happened in the second phase of the Arab Spring. First, there was Tunisia, very popular, kind of a lot of unity. Then the uprising against Mubarak in Egypt, that was January 2011. And there was so much solidarity. I mean, you know, the young people who took over the Capitol building in Madison, Wisconsin, they were having people in Egypt from the center of Cairo were ordering pizzas and sending pizzas to the Capitol building in Madison to show solidarity. So there was this kind of feeling of global solidarity. And you see that again in Occupy, which also became a little bit of a global phenomenon. That was again, a spontaneous movement in September 2011. And I'd like to spend, if we can find some time to talk about that too, because I think it's very impactful. But I want to go to the question you're asking, which is once the Arab Spring shifted and U.S. imperialism was able to take advantage of basically what was a spontaneous and leaderless movement, and thus a movement that could be manipulated, the U.S. entered the fray both in Syria and in Libya to carry out and using the issue of freedom and democracy in the Arab world as a pretext, a long-standing goal of U.S. foreign policy, which was to topple independent regimes in Syria and Libya. And you don't have to love Muammar Gaddafi or Assad to recognize that the U.S. was targeting these governments not because they were anti-democratic, not because the U.S. loved human rights, but because the U.S. wanted to topple governments that had any connection to the post-World War II anti-colonial project. I mean, Syria, Iraq, Libya, I mean, the whole pan-Arab revolutionary phenomena, which went through different stages and phases, that was a consequence of an anti-colonial revolutionary wave that swept the Middle East, and it pushed U.S. imperialism back. When the Green Revolution took place in Libya and Wheeler Air Base was seized and Gaddafi and the Libyans took power, the U.S. went to war against Gaddafi. They tried to kill Gaddafi during the Reagan period. The U.S. bombed downtown Tripoli. The bombing killed Gaddafi's 2-year-old daughter. Didn't kill him, but killed lots of civilians. Yeah. And you could see the U.S. has always wanted to target Iraq. Yes, it collaborated with Saddam at times, just like it collaborated with the Assad government at times, just like it collaborated with Gaddafi sometimes. And yet, when possible, if there was an opportunity to overthrow these governments and create what the U.S. hoped would be colonial puppet governments like the good old colonial days, that was the organic tendency of U.S. foreign policy. So there was this struggle for freedom and democracy in Tunisia and in Egypt, and then the U.S. turns it and takes advantage of it to support counter-revolutionary forces in Syria and in Libya. And Gaddafi said, if you succeed in overthrowing me, you're going to have Al-Qaeda here in Libya. And that was considered by the Western media to just be BS, just to be like Gaddafi's rhetorical flourish. But he was right. And the same is true in the Assad government, in the case of Syria. I mean, if Assad had been crushed and defeated as the U.S. and the Obama administration determined, what would we have? We'd have an Al-Qaeda or an Al-Qaeda type government in Damascus. I mean, the impact would be profound for the people in Syria and the people regionally. And we had a split in the U.S. anti-war movement. I mean, the groups that I still work with, I won't mention some of their names, but everybody knows them. Some of them said to the Answer Coalition and to me personally, we can't work with you anymore because we're standing with the Syrian revolution against Assad, or we're standing with the Libyan revolution against Gaddafi. And I was like, these are not revolutions. These are counter-revolutions. Like every counter-revolutions don't announce themselves as counter-revolutions. They announce themselves as revolutions because it's something hopeful, something new, something better. They don't say we're going backwards. They say we're going forward. So there's no counter-revolution that announces itself as a counter-revolution. It's just a new revolution. But if you have a new revolution supported by the CIA, supported by the Erdogan regime in Turkey, supported by the Saudis, I mean, all of these ultra-reactionary forces are somehow supporting revolutionaries. And at the same time, you have big parts of the U.S. left on the same side. And, I wrote a book, a small pamphlet called Socialists in War, which was a polemic against the organization ISO, International Socialist Organization at that time, because they were standing with the Syrian revolution.
I remember.
We were making the argument it's not a revolution, it's a counter-revolution. And why would U.S. imperialism be supporting a genuine revolution? Name one place in the world where U.S. imperialism, the Saudi monarchy, and Erdogan support and give arms and money to genuine revolutionaries. Like, you can't name any because it doesn't exist. And they would say, no, you're just an apologist for Assad, or you're just an apologist for Gaddafi. I mean, the same sort of demonizing rhetoric where people I think because they don't want to stand up to the demonization that's rampant in bourgeois society when the media turns all of its attention on the target. So Gaddafi was Hitler, just like Assad became Hitler. Like once the person is, demonized at that level, the way the war in Russia is being presented. Mm-hmm. If you say, look, the U.S. is helping and created the crisis that led to the Ukraine war. Yes, Russia intervened on February 24th. You don't have to say that's a good thing to acknowledge the fact that NATO obviously, recklessly, provocatively, and deliberately created this crisis and did so because U.S. imperialism has its own agenda in Europe. If you say that, you say, oh, you're a Putin apologist. So this is the refrain used by imperialism in the imperialist media, and it's echoed by the left. It's echoed by big parts of the left if you take a principled anti-imperialist position.
Right.
So we lost a lot of friends during that time. And as you said, in the Palestinian movement, and the Answer Coalition had been leading all of the mass protests in partnership with the Arab American, Palestinian, Muslim, and South Asian communities for Palestine. And we were the tendency within the U.S. left that was the most, explicitly pro-Palestinian and breaking the taboo on Palestine solidarity. People then say, well, we can't work with you because you're supporting Assad or you're supporting Gaddafi. And that was the real tragedy of what happened. But again, it's the absence of political clarity. And I think the reason there are conflicting trends between secular and Islamic forces inside of the Middle East. When it was just Iraq or just the attack on Muslims in the early part of the war on terror, there was unity. But then it broke apart. By the way, I was at a conference, Rania, in Cairo in December 2003 against the war in Iraq. And it was organized. There was the Muslim Brotherhood. There was the socialists. There were non-socialist independent secularists. There was the anti-war movement from Stop the War Coalition from Britain. And Answer Coalition was there. And I was there with Ramsey Clark. And while we were there, Saddam Hussein was arrested. He was captured by the U.S. in December 2003. And at that moment, the secular and socialist forces said we should demand that Saddam Hussein be released because he's been captured by U.S. imperialism and their puppets. And the Muslim Brotherhood forces like, no, we don't want to support the release of Saddam Hussein. Yeah. He's the butcher of Islamic forces in Iraq. And the conference, which had all of this unity, literally broke up into fistfights.
Wow.
We were the whole thing blew up. And all of the forces who were like marching together against U.S. imperialism in Iraq immediately went to, conflict with each other. It took a lot to kind of calm things down. By the way, at the end of the conference, even though there was disunity, the Mubarak regime arrested people from both sides as soon as the conference was over, as was to be expected. But this is one of the struggles that's going on in the Middle East, obviously, and you know well about it. And it was muffled in a way in 2001 and 2002 and 2003, when the struggle was just U.S. imperialism war against Muslims and Arabs in general, and before these kind of differentiations took place.
Yeah, that was really, really well put. And then I wanted to, before I move on to the issue of Trump getting elected and what that did to the left, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about Occupy Wall Street. Because I mean, obviously, like what's happening in terms of the global order is important, but there was also a lot happening domestically in the US, especially after the banks collapsed, and people, especially around my age, were really angry because we were all in student debt and had no opportunities. There weren't any jobs. Everyone's a barista. It's a very difficult time.
Right. I think Occupy was a real harbinger of what became the revival of socialism in the United States. Without the Occupy movement, there wouldn't have been a Bernie Sanders socialist revival that started sort of unexpectedly in 2015 and 2016. And again, the socialist parties, I'm in the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I helped found that party in 2004. We have grown, exponentially in recent years. And so have other organizations like Democratic Socialists of America. We're a Marxist tendency. DSA considers itself a social democratic organization. These organizations grew exponentially in 2016, 2017, and beyond. But Occupy Wall Street was this kind of beginning of the reemergence of class politics, but in a very weirdly defined way, or badly defined way, because it didn't have leadership. The fatal flaw of Occupy was anarchist tactics, actually, because, and I'm not putting down anarchists in general, I'm just saying the anarchist tactics of refusing to have a leadership that could actually lead and have decisive activity. It bogged down all around the country in all of these encampments. But when people came together, and I was part of the initial meetings of Occupy a month before the first tent went up in Zuccotti Park in Wall Street, there was a whole group of people. Some were Marxists, some were anarchists, some were liberals. We were all talking about how to do this. And on September 17th, it started in 2011, and it was police repression. The police, of course, in New York City, acting like pigs as they normally do, massively tried to repress it, and that had the opposite effect. And Occupy took off, and people set up spontaneously, self-acting groups and individuals around the country set up encampments. But the slogan was, "We are the 99%," meaning we are not the 1%. We are not the bourgeoisie. We are not the capitalists. The movement had no demands. That was one of its weaknesses. But it was reflective or emblematic of a sentiment as a consequence of the 2008, 2009 capitalist economic crisis, where big parts of the population, including people who went to college and yes, had a lot of student debt, but they expected they could get jobs that weren't barista jobs so they could pay the debt back. Right. And there were no jobs. 9 million families were in foreclosure as a consequence. 30 million people lost their jobs. An entire generation of young people who were getting out of college with staggering levels of debt couldn't find, jobs. So people were working 2, 3 jobs. So there was this kind of defuturization of even what had been an upwardly mobile part of the capitalist society. And those people became the human material that formed the Occupy movement. So they're young middle-class people, predominantly white, but not exclusively. It became then in other areas, in rural areas, very working class. And then it started to proliferate, but you started to see billboards all over the country. Occupy, Occupy, Occupy as a slogan became part of public consciousness. And even though it was ill-defined, it was the beginning, the reshaping of class consciousness. The reason this is important is in the United States, for a long time after, and as a consequence of anti-communism, all of the mass movements in the United States had to present themselves as non-ideological, non-class, and non-socialist movements. They were always issue-oriented or constituency-oriented movements to either address problems with a particular issue like war or women's rights or gay rights or marriage equality or disabled rights, like single issue focused movements, or constituency-based movements like to help this or that very oppressed sector in society. But by having Occupy, we are the 99%, we are against the 1%, it presents society as a class-based division. Right. And so that was a huge contributor to the reshaping of consciousness. Then, of course, in 2014, when Mike Brown was killed, and the rebellion, the new iteration of the Black liberation movement, which is always the detonator for other social movements in the United States, it comes back to life. Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black lives. There's been this 2-generation skip since the Black liberation movement of the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. So it's starting with a really different ideological orientation and political orientation. But nonetheless, it was the reemergence of really the historic Black liberation movement. So you had the intersection then of a newly kind of semi-socialist and re-emerging Black liberation movement at a time when the capitalist economic crisis, the repercussions of which were still being felt. That's what led to the surprising Bernie Sanders campaign, which again sort of removed the taboo on socialism and allowed a conversation about socialism to actually take place in the United States. And it's weird. I mean, Bernie Sanders, like this old white man, didn't really have an outstandingly radical career in the U.S. Senate or before that in the House of Representatives. He was pretty a mainstream social democratic type personality, but he became the vessel for like tens of millions of young people saying, yeah, I'm a socialist. I don't know what it means, but that's what I am. And so that led to this new like political conjuncture in U.S. politics.
And it definitely had a huge impact on a sort of surge in interests in socialism, especially among younger people. But then, of course, Bernie Sanders lost the election. We talked a little bit about that in our last episode, but we didn't get to touch on the issue of Trump winning and what that did to the left. And I think, when Trump did win in 2016, as horrified as I was, I thought, well, for sure, this will actually like unite people in opposition to all of the horrible policies that Trump is going to continue to support and escalate, whether it's wars abroad or just like right-wing economic policies domestically. And it didn't go that way. And I don't know if it was so much a split on the left as the left seemed to fade a bit because of the fact that like centrists and liberals became the quote unquote resistance to Trump, at least as far as like getting the mainstream platforms to look like the resistance to Trump. So in your opinion, what impact did the election of Donald Trump and then Russiagate? Oh God, the issue of Russiagate. What did that have? What impact did that have on the left, on the anti-war left, on the, anti-capitalist left in the United States?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think there's a lot that was unexpected about the Trump victory. I didn't expect Trump to win.
Yeah.
As most people did not. I mean, almost everybody thought it was a joke. I think even Trump was had his jet on the tarmac ready to go the next day. He had no expectation of winning. He was just promoting the Trump brand. But, sure enough, he lost the popular vote by 3 million. But because we have this anachronistic slave-based electoral system, he still wins the election narrowly. And it was a shocker. And at first, it had an amazing sort of unifying impact for progressive forces. I mean, when he said, we're going to stop Muslims, we're going to ban Muslims, we're not going to let Muslims come back to the United States, even people who were U.S. citizens. I mean, people went to the airports and occupied the airports. People were in the streets. We started in Washington, we started organizing volunteer meetings for scheduled protest at Trump's inauguration, which was scheduled for January 20th, of course, in 2017. And we couldn't have them in our office because hundreds of people, young people mainly, were coming. And, and at Trump's inauguration, we had 15,000 people, but there was probably another 50 or 80,000 people all along the parade route protesting against Trump. And at that time, those of us in the Answer Coalition and in PSL, we've tried to form something called the People's Congress of Resistance, because we feared that the Democrats, having this enormous machine in U.S. politics and having an obvious interest in getting rid of Trump and replacing Trump, not from a progressive point of view, but because they want to control the capitalist state. Mm-hmm. They want to be the captains of the military-industrial complex. They're actually not. There's no principles in the Democratic Party. I mean, even now in this election, they've been funding extreme right-wing and fascist candidates in the Republican Party, giving them tens of millions of dollars of Democrats' money because they think, they're going to be easier to defeat in November. So you have Democrats who will do anything just to retain office and don't care at all about real values and principles. And we feared that the Democrats would try to grab hold of this genuine, organic, anti-Trump resistance, which was very progressive. It was anti-racist. It was against misogyny. It was in defense of women, defense of workers' rights, anti-racist. It was organic. It was real. That's why people were at all the airports. But the Democratic Party,
Right.
we felt, unless they were challenged and unless we found a way to have an independent, sufficiently strong organizing vehicle to challenge the Democrats and say the problem isn't, if Trump is the problem, the solution is not the Democrats, because the real problem is the capitalist system. It's the system of imperialism. And these two ruling class parties just take turns running the system for the benefit of the bourgeoisie, for the benefit of the imperialists. And so we created this People's Congress of Resistance. We had an amazing conference. We were trying to build an independent road, but we were overwhelmed because the US mass media, which was anti-Trump with the exception of Fox, and the Democratic Party created this fiction that Trump won and Hillary Clinton lost, not because she was an awful candidate, not because she was a neoliberal capitalist, not because the Democrats were not actually offering anything, not because the Democrats, who had taken in many people who would have historically voted Republican and had voted for Barack Obama, but they lost them because they didn't do anything for them, because the Democrats are really just the party of Wall Street and the party of the Pentagon and the military industrial complex. Instead of that being the cause, the real cause for Trump was Putin. The real cause for Trump was that he was an agent of the Kremlin, that Russia had somehow interfered in the election so significantly that Donald Trump became president. And so for 3 years, all of the progressive people, and I'm talking about, except for the people like in real organized left groups like PSL or Answer, almost everybody got taken in and duped. And they really thought Russia had intervened. It was Putin's malicious actions. And ultimately, Robert Mueller, the former head of the FBI, who was the guy in charge of rounding up the Muslims after September 11th, he was in charge of the FBI. He did all that. He was the one who, carried out the Patriot Act, where they were looking at what books you were reading in the library. Somehow Robert Mueller was going to be this bastion of democracy and bring down Donald Trump and expose him for what he was, the agent of Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin. And then life would go back to normal. So all of this progressive resistance that was organic at the beginning was actually turned into a reactionary phenomena. I mean, the resistance actually became reactionary because it really created such an animus. Historically, Rania, when I was a kid, the people who said ban the bomb and the people who said they were for peace were basically voting Democratic. Uh-huh. And now you have the people who are voting Democratic who seem to be the most warlike, hawkish, pro-imperialist elements in society. So the places where you would expect the peace movement to have some connection don't exist. Mm-hmm. And so the Republicans also, and I think Trump did this pretty well, and I think the Republicans are doing it pretty well too now, demagogically pretending to be against the U.S. war effort in Ukraine. The Republicans, if Trump comes back and the Republicans win, they're going to do the same thing
exactly
Biden is doing right now, but they're pretending to be against all of this war because truthfully, the working class in America doesn't want to be an endless war. It doesn't want to spend all of its money for the Pentagon. It doesn't want that. So you have the Republicans demagogically taking advantage of this, and the Democrats in their iteration of what it meant to be part of the resistance against Trump actually moved the country dramatically to the right. And so you had, during the past 4 years, I would say, a lot of confusion. Even some of the people who were on the left are now flirting with the right. They're not just flirting. They're dating. They're beyond flirting. They're going out with the right. They're connecting to the right. And it's part of the confusion caused by this failure to be able to navigate the very confusing turbulent political times where the Democrats, in their effort to stop Trump, don't fight him on a progressive basis. They actually don't. They don't really, determine. They could have a determined fight for abortion. They could have done that. They didn't do any of those things. They mainly made it like Trump was pro-Putin or pro-Russia. And so that has had a very big impact on the left. And even parts of what I would consider the social democratic left have been swept into that sort of pro-imperialist, pro-militarist orientation. And that's one of the problems right now.
It's a huge problem. And like there's people have come up with different terminology to describe that. They call it the post-left is one thing I've seen come up a lot in terms of the sort of segment of people that you're talking about who like were on the left or say they're on the left, but have actually turned right. And there is a lot of confusion. But one thing that's, we talked a bit about that in our last episode. But one thing that we didn't talk about, because this has become a more I don't know if I want to say more prominent issue, but I want to bring up the issue of Lyndon LaRouche, because Lyndon LaRouche is a figure who's, he's dead now, but he was around a long time, had this like cult that, he started out left wing, became a right winger to the point where he was basically sending people out to beat communists, literally beat up communists. But a very marginal figure with like a marginal cult following, but they've suddenly like become, I don't know, they're in the public like space again because some of their people have been like protesting members of the squad for giving money to Ukraine. One of the ones that went viral was this video of AOC being protested by a LaRoucheite. And this is what they do, right? They like kind of, it's a marginal group. They cause these like spectacles to get everybody talking about them. And that's how they end up getting, platforms to go, spread their message. And the reason I raise this is because it has been getting a lot of attention, but also it is a part of this phenomenon you're talking about where people are being pulled into this weird right-wing space that claims to be anti-war, but I don't actually think it is, especially when you have people like in this particular case throwing out somebody like AOC should be more like Tulsi Gabbard, somebody who isn't left-wing. And if there was anything left-wing, has pretty much like distanced herself from that at this point. But I wanted to get your reaction to this because you've been organizing quite some time. I'm sure you've periodically over the, years, come into contact with these people, the LaRoucheites, if you will. I don't know how much significant or important they are, but I guess I wanted to ask you about it more as like a trend. And what do you think is happening with this now? And what is this weird, bizarre, like, I don't even know what to call it. It's not a coalition, but it's this grouping of people who are like claiming to be anti-war, and claiming to be left, but actually aren't.
Right. Well, just a little thing about the LaRouche grouping. It was a tendency within SDS in the late 1960s. It was a weird sort of split from Trotskyism. And then, and when they were in part of the left, I lived in Rochester, New York. My brother Richard and I were organizers in 1970, a long time ago. And we had meetings with them, and they were just a weird sort of marginal, bizarre left group, but we knew them. In 1971 or 72, they became they took this right-wing racist turn, and they started attacking meetings of the Communist Party, physical assaults. I mean, like where lots of people were injured, armed assaults on Communist Party, Socialist Workers Party, and most notably against the National Welfare Rights Organization, which was a black organization, predominantly 90% black organization. And the LaRoucheites would carry out physical assaults against the welfare rights meetings, which were mainly welfare recipients who were coming together, organizing for rights, for political and social and economic rights for welfare recipients in the U.S. And then through the whole 70s, they became, through their different front groups, they create lots of front groups. They became basically a pro-FBI voice. They started attacking the anti-nuclear movement in the late 1970s after 3 Mile Island. We literally had to defend our meetings from physical assaults from the LaRouche people. So when people say it doesn't matter if they're saying something good and they're against the war, and it doesn't matter who they are, well, just think about that for a second. If Mussolini, who had been a socialist at one time before he became the leader of fascism in Italy, if people allied with Mussolini happen to have the same position that you do on some issue, do you think like, oh, that's fine? Or if the KKK takes a position, that's against, sending money to Ukraine, do we say, oh yeah, let's be with the KKK? I mean, it does matter. It matters a lot what the nature of the group is. And the LaRouchites are a dangerous group. They go through different iterations. They rebrand themselves, but their tendency is very much to the right, very much to the far right. And as a consequence, they sometimes do things that people think, oh, that's good. They broke up AOC. They broke up AOC's meeting. Well, why did they do that? I mean, are they doing it because they're trying to move the country in a revolutionary direction and they want to overcome liberalism and create a mass socialist movement? That's not the LaRouchites. They're a reactionary force. They're a politically reactionary force. And who they are does matter. And I think it's really weird and unfortunate for people to say, well, AOC has a bad position on the war, so let's support basically right wingers who break up her meetings. Like, just people should think about the consequences of that.
Yeah.
I think the LaRouchites at different times reemerge as a factor. So I've known them literally now for 50 years as a tendency. And it's very noteworthy that when they become stronger again, which is usually very short-lived, it coincides with some social or political crisis, or in response to a movement or an embryonic mass movement forming. Like in the anti-nuclear movement, they became a very big force attacking the anti-nuclear movement in 1979, when it really looked like the anti-nuclear movement against the use of nuclear energy, which then expanded into the nuclear freeze movement, was going to become something powerful. They were openly pro-FBI throughout the whole 70s. They were for the FBI and the repression directed against progressive forces. So I think they're very suspicious in my mind. I think they're a tool. I think that because they are a cult and they have a cult following, they're like an easy cadre that can be sort of moved into action or swept into action. And I really think it's extremely important for the left and progressive forces not to be duped and not to collaborate in any way with the LaRouche forces. From time to time, they take a position that will seem anti-imperialist. They were opposing the U.S. invasion of Panama, for instance, in 1989. They made connections with Noriega. They became like friends of Noriega. So they kind of find their way. They sort of infiltrate into different areas of where there's political crisis, but people should really beware of them.
Yeah, I really hope people take that to heart, because it is a bit disturbing to see like the level of, and it's mostly just online, but also like especially when it comes with like a cult, because it actually ruins people's lives, on top of everything you just said. But I think this is a good point, like to turn to something important, because we can sit here and talk about what's wrong with the left all day, right? But right now we're dealing with this looming, if not already, in its like a very dangerous phase, Cold War with Russia and China. And we're all like accused of being authoritarian apologists for opposing that Cold War, which is something that, being anti-war, it's just what happens in this country, is that you're going to get accused of all kinds of horrible things. But I want to end on here. I wanted to ask you if we could maybe talk about what would be a genuine left strategic framework and plan, that like what that would look like inside the US. As an organizer, you're somebody who's working on developing and pursuing that. And I think that's what people like need to start to look towards, right? Is like, we can sit here and talk all day about the problems that we have in the world, but if we don't have a way to tackle them, I mean, it doesn't really mean anything other than just like sitting around and I guess complaining about it. So what do you have to say in that aspect of this, the sort of strategic, tactical framework that we need on the left to move forward in this increasingly kind of scary, apocalyptic world that we're moving towards?
Yeah. Well, I thank you for asking that, because I think it is the question. And I certainly have no interest in being a critic of the left, or actually of anything. I want to change society. And the part of Marxism that was so attractive to me as a young organizer was, the point that Marx made. He was obviously a genius, a brilliant philosopher, economist, and so on. He said, philosophers have tried to interpret the world. Our point is to change the world. And all of the traditions of revolutionary Marxism is to use Marxism not as a method for critique, but as a guide for action. And so those of us who are devoted and lifelong socialist Marxists, have tried to put that into practice. In 2004, we started a Party for Socialism and Liberation, for instance, a very small. We had like 30 people. Today, we are very, growing exponentially. We have an organized presence in 93 cities, and we have had and tried to apply a step-by-step approach towards organizing, which is based on a positive program rather than simply a critique, either a critique of society or a critique of other progressive forces. And I think that's what people are really looking for. They want to do something that makes a change. I mean, if you believe that people are the power, if the power is in the people, if the people are mobilized, how is it and why is it that people actually spend their time, volunteering, organizing, sacrificing, taking risks? Why do people do that? And if you look at that over history, like how did the civil rights movement or the women's rights movement or any of the mass movements, the workers' rights movement, why did people do those things? They had a sense that what they were doing could make a difference. If people have some degree of hope and some degree of optimism and some conviction that their actions can make a difference, then some part of the population is willing to sacrifice a great deal in order to create change. In terms of the strategic framework for myself and the position I've been advocating for some time and inside the PSL, for instance, we believe that the last 20 years demonstrates that there's a great desire through all of these activist movements that you and I have been talking about, Rania, for change. There was the anti-globalization movement, the anti-war movement. In 2006, the immigrant rights movement, which was huge. Then you had Occupy, Black Lives Matter, the Bernie Sanders campaign, the mass uprisings against racism in 2020 after George Floyd was killed, where 25 million people came out and stayed out in the streets for months. These are indicators that people really do want change and they're willing to organize for it. And more parts of the population are being swept into it, people who had no connection previously to politics. But what we think is most important is, one, to have a clear analysis of the world situation, not to be bouncing like chickens without heads off of each issue, not to have emotional reactions, and certainly not to be bouncing off of life on the internet and life in Twitter world or other social media platforms, where you're basically in this very small circular loop with your friends and saying things and reacting to things in a way that is designed to create a positive reaction from your friends. The goal really is to reach the people who are outside of the left right now and who are really suffering from unemployment, from low wages, from housing that's not affordable, from racism, from police brutality, from mass incarceration, people who don't want endless war. And that program, the programs that we designed to go out and to organize and to build in those communities and in those spaces, has to be based on a progressive orientation and on progressive demands. So, for instance, all around the United States right now, our people are organizing for affordable housing. They're in communities working with tenants and working with people who are fighting for affordable housing. That might seem mundane, but that's where you really meet people who are suffering and who are also seeking change. And from those parts of the population, new leadership arises. So it's not just the same old heads talking. You're finding all of the creative energy of working class folks and young people in particular who really have so much to offer. In 2019, we adopted a strategic framework based on what we consider to be what we anticipate will happen over the next decade, 10 to 15 years. So it's a plan based on what we anticipate. Will what we anticipate happen? Nobody knows, because we don't pretend to have a crystal ball. But if you don't have an assessment and a plan that corresponds to your assessment, you can't even deviate from it based on new developments. You're just sort of running around doing what? I mean, not having a plan. There are three existential crises that society is facing that we believe the capitalist ruling class will not be able to resolve. Not because they're not solvable problems, but it's the nature of capitalism and the nature of our particularly US capitalist system. One crisis is the drive towards endless war. We believe the US is moving towards a global conflict, and the inherent war drive that's sort of organic and foundational to capitalism is driving capitalism to do these reckless, provocative things. Ukraine is one example. The Ukraine war is going to escalate. The Ukraine war, the danger of the Ukraine war cannot be overstated. I mean, right now, the US is moving B-61 thermonuclear gravity nuclear bombs, thermonuclear bombs into NATO bases all over Europe. Right now, as we're speaking, they're going there on an expedited basis. Why are they going there? They're preparing for actual nuclear confrontation with Russia. They're doing the same with China and Taiwan. Does this make sense? No. Is it crazy? Yes. Are they doing it? Yes, again. That's the nature of the US capitalist imperialist system, is it's in this drive for endless war. Look at what happened after World War II, what happened after World War I. These are periods where revolutions happen. War actually leads to revolution. And we think that's an existential phenomena in capitalism, and it's going to become ever more dominant. Second existential crisis is climate catastrophe. It needs to be mitigated. We know exactly what's happening. The handwriting is on the wall. And yet capitalism won't do what's needed to take emergency actions to stop using carbon-based fuels. I mean, there needs to be an immediate end to the use of carbon fuels, or a plan over the next decade to do that. You look at what happened with Hurricane Ian and the destruction of southern Florida. That's our future. This is what's going to grow and grow and grow, and it's already happening. And there's a third existential crisis, which is 60% or 70% of the jobs as we know them today will be gone in a decade because of artificial intelligence and the use of high technology under the system of capitalism. If you had artificial intelligence replacing the drudgery of working class jobs so that people could have more time with their families, more time to recreate, more time for cultural and educational opportunities, that would be good. But what will happen under capitalism is people will be thrown into unemployment and into poverty. So we believe that these intersecting, multiple, and cascading crises of society are coming. They're already evolving very dynamically. And we actually believe that there will be a crisis in society such that there could be a radical transformation in society if we can convince the majority of the population of the validity of socialist ideas and the socialist political program. To that end, we've just published a book called Socialist Reconstruction, A Better Future in the United States, which is a comprehensive examination of what socialism would actually look like, not in Venezuela, not in Cuba, not in Russia in 1917, but in the United States, in advanced economic, industrial, and scientific power. And so one strategic framework is political and political consciousness raising and political education to win people over in the context of crisis, that there must be and is an alternative to capitalism. And the second crisis is that there is going to be an effort by the right wing in the United States to negate basic democratic norms. And I'm talking about bourgeois democratic norms, the things that we take for granted. So we believe that the sort of gridlock and the failure of the capitalist system to resolve its own crises right now is leading in the direction of an effort by the right wing to create a permanent right wing government in the United States, to shift and change the way government is formed in the United States. obviously to get rid of the popular vote, to attack voting rights, and even to attack the existing electoral college because, Rania, 83% of the people in the United States live in cities. The people who live in cities don't like the right-wing program. The majority in the country really doesn't support the right wing. They support and lean towards our program. So the right wing can't really succeed with the existing form of government. So there will be an attempt to negate actual basic democratic rights. That's coming. We can see it in upcoming Supreme Court cases. I think the January 6th effort to overturn the election was a dress rehearsal. And so there is a basic fight for democracy intersecting with the need for a new economic and social system, socialism. And we think that that's the positive program in one sense of fighting for something better, but also defending democratic rights that are fiercely being attacked, including as we see the extinguishing of abortion rights. Anyway, this is going to be an epic struggle. When you look at the last 250 years and look at the processes of revolution, they happen when it's these kind of intersecting crises. And for people who say, oh, it'll never happen in the United States. Well, the people in France in 1788, the year before the French Revolution, said the same thing about France. And the people in Haiti in 1790 thought that about Haiti. And the people in Europe before 1830 or 1848 or Russia in 1916, people never think the revolution is coming. But if social crises are so great and the ruling class is so unable to solve them or unwilling to solve them, these are the moments when people go into action, and they won't succeed. We won't succeed without a positive program. It's not enough to snipe at the Democrats or the Republicans. We have to have a real alternative plan that we can convince people of is actually in their interest. Is that a big job? Yes. Is it, an avoidable job? No. If we're going to win, that's what we have to do.
Well, on that note, Brian, that's got me all fired up. Can you tell everybody where they can follow you and your excellent work, which also is a little bit self-promotional because you have a program on Breakthrough News, but please go ahead.
Sure. The name of the program is The Socialist Program. So it's on all streaming services and every Wednesday night at 7 p.m. on Breakthrough News. You can also go, if you're interested in socialism, go to pslweb.org or liberationnews.org. And you can also buy that book, Socialist Reconstruction, A Better Future for the United States. That's a brand new book. It's taken us a couple of years to write it. It's a collective product. I think when people read it, they're going to be very impressed that the socialists actually have a program for how society could be reorganized in a way that's very beneficial for everybody.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for coming and spending the hour with me to break all this down. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for watching, everyone. If you want to see more progressive anti-imperialist content like this, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can stay up to date with the latest Breakthrough News content. And if you want to support our work and get access to exclusive content, head over to patreon.com/breakthroughnews.